Since 1933, Rainbird Corporation has been the leading manufacturer and provider of irrigation products and services. Since its beginnings, Rainbird has offered the industry's broadest range of irrigation products for farms, golf courses, sports arenas, commercial developments, and homes in more than 130 countries around the world. Rainbird has been awarded more than 450 patents worldwide, including the first in 1935 for the original horizontal action impact drive sprinkler, which revolutionized the food production industry and ushered in a new era in irrigation worldwide. Today, Rainbird offers over 4,000 irrigation products and services.
Applying water to plants when they need it in the most water efficient manner is what this company is about.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm not sure where our introducer is, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Michael Boland. I'm the Chief Park Officer at the Presidio Trust in San Francisco, and I'm delighted to be here with all you today, and I hope you all buy Rainbird irrigation heads for your parks. I'm delighted here today to, on behalf of the Large Urban Parks Committee of the World Urban Parks, so this is the first of my many shameless plugs for joining the Large Urban Parks Committee. I think we're getting please turn up the volume. Or is that me? Here, I'll hold it really close. I'm here to talk about some work that we've been doing in the Large Urban Parks Committee, thinking about the future of large urban parks, and specifically thinking a little bit about large urban parks in 2050. So first, I want to start by giving a shout out to my committee. This is a group of folks from all around the world that are focused on large urban parks, past, present, and future. And we have a very good time, so come join us. Peter is here, he's part of us. Carl's joined us recently, so please come and join us. Your park doesn't, we're very flexible about what large means, so please come. The last thing I want to say is that everything I'm going to say is I'm the only person responsible for it. So if I say anything weird, don't hold these guys accountable. It's all my crazy thoughts. None of them belong to them. But what I do want to talk about is I want to talk about large urban parks in the future. And to do that, I think it's really important that we think about large urban parks in the past. Because from my perspective, we are still beholden to this guy, right here, Frederick Law Olmsted, and the original thinking that went into the creation of Central Park. Central Park, as you know, was built in the 1860s in the middle of New York City, and it set the stage for so much of the ideology that still controls the thinking that goes into both the development and the management of large urban parks in the world today. Thinking like that, from my perspective, is very much out of date. So, for example, the large urban park, Central Park, was really predicated on the idea that nature sits in opposition to the city, which is a very old idea these days. Here we are in the Anthropocene. And it sets up this dichotomy, this boundedness between the city and the park. Although it looked pretty, and it looked like nature, of course, we all know that most large urban parks were built really to replicate a picture of nature. And Central Park in particular was a major construction project. I love these construction shots that show them, with bulldozers moving land and moving rocks and putting in plumbing. Because, of course, there's absolutely nothing about Central Park in New York that's natural. It's an entirely synthetic designed landscape full of non-native species, primarily non-native species. There's ongoing issues with the invasiveness of many of those species, in fact, in Central Park. And I think that one of the other really important things is Olmsted designed these parks as a place where recent immigrants could learn what it means to be an American. And I think that if you read some of the kind of sort of literature of Central Park, it speaks very glowingly about how it was a landscape where it was democratic and a place where everybody from many backgrounds could come together. But the fact is, it's a place where social behavior was heavily controlled. And there were a host of things that were okay and a host of things that were not okay. And it was really an engine for assimilation, driven by a series of experts, an expert corps, because the thing that happened also with the creation of Central Park was it was the beginning of a park agency. And this notion that parks should be administered by experts. He was the first superintendent of the park. And he built an engine of people around him that controlled the way people behaved. And I think it's interesting that one of the earliest conflicts that he writes about was the conflict between the desires of new immigrants that wanted to play baseball and other active sports in Central Park and his aesthetic aspirations for the site. And the conflict between those things, which became quite intense. Ultimately, as those of you who know the park, the baseball players won. But for many years, this tension between the desires of different groups and the aesthetic aspirations of Olmsted created a tension that I think plays itself out today in the management of so many parks that we run today. The last thing that I think is important about Central Park is it was built in a place that was not empty land. It was a place that was included a village, a community of African Americans of free slaves called Seneca Village, and they were displaced to build Central Park. So this wasn't empty land, and this is an issue in the United States particularly that comes up over and over again, that the creation of large urban parks often involved the displacement of people with less power in order to create those parks. So this isn't a very pretty legacy from my perspective, many of these things, and I think what's most important is it doesn't really prepare us very well for the challenges we face in the 21st century. And so from my perspective, although there's no question these places are incredibly beautiful, but that they really are not, they don't, as I mentioned, set us up for the kinds of challenges that we face in the 21st century. And I looked, wow, concert. I looked back at 1850 and 2050, and it's amazing, the difference. Of course, the climate will be considerably hotter. In 1850, there were 1.2 billion people on Earth. By 2050, there'll be just shy of 10 billion. In fact, there'll be as many people that are displaced by climate change as there were on the entire planet in 1850. 75% of the people on our planet will live in cities. That's exactly the opposite of what the world was like in 1850. And by then, unless we take action, 1/3 of the plants and animals on Earth will be extinct, that are on the Earth today will be extinct. So how can we use the same sort of park models and address these problems successfully? Well, we can't. So it's time for us to move on. And we've been, in our committee, talking a little bit about some of the changes that we need to make, and that's what I'd like to focus on today. So the first thing we need to do is we need to abandon the picturesque. We need to abandon this model, and we've heard many people speak about this over the last couple days. This idea that we need to get out of a dichotomized view of nature and culture, and that we really need to embrace the Anthropocene, that we need to accept the fact that we have an outsized impact on the planet, and we need to shift from seeing ourselves as the destroyers of nature to actually see ourselves as a keystone species. We're a species in an ecosystem that has benefits for all of the other organisms, plants and animals that live in that ecosystem, that we have a beneficial impact on the ecosystem, supporting these other systems rather than the negative one, which is a really important mindset shift that we need to undertake. That we need to break down these boundaries and be more thoughtful about how we think about nature, that nature is not both aesthetic and ecological considerations. Those are actually separate considerations. And in so much of landscape, we confuse those things because of this history of the picturesque. We look at something that looks natural and we think it has ecological value. And conversely, we look at landscapes that don't look natural and assume they have no ecological value. Neither of those things are necessarily true. And we need to approach the restoration of the environment from a human-centered perspective, with a human-centered perspective, because human action in the environment is one of the great destroyers of ecological value. But if we understand the needs of people as we're beginning a restoration project, then we can both accommodate human use and human desires and improve the ecological health of the environments in our planet. We also need to deepen our understanding of what these new kinds of ecologies, how they actually operate. We don't really understand very well how urban ecology works, how an environment full of people can actually have beneficial ecological systems and processes. So we need to focus our attention not on studying wilderness, but focus our attention so much more on studying the ecology of cities so that we can understand actually how they work in a much deeper and richer way. And that we need to really reimagine these traditional forms of landscape. You know, it's interesting to me that many of the landscape forms that we use in our cities are really relatively unchanged for centuries. We still have cities full of hedges and foundation plantings and lawns and all of these things. I mean, these are like 15th century ideas, you know, and we keep replicating them. So how do we reimagine all of those landscape typologies that are so traditional and that we have so many fond associations with, reimagine those in more ecological ways, in ways that allow us to integrate ecological value into these traditional forms? And how do we rethink the practice of horticulture? So many parks, for the first 20 years of my career, we had a maintenance department and we had a natural resources department. And they were actually in completely different parts of our organization. And I think that's true for many of our parks. So how do we integrate those two approaches, those two traditions to the stewardship of land into an integrated, unified whole that is ecological horticulture, which draws from the best of both of those traditions? All right. Okay, everyone, this is get up and dance, wake up. That's very impressive. So not only do we need to think about what is going on inside our parks, I truly believe that as park stewards, we need to solve the problems of the 21st century by operating outside the park walls, by operating outside our boundaries. And I've heard so many interesting presentations over the last couple days about this idea. And I think it's absolutely essential. We need to break down these boundaries and we need to think holistically. Because wildlife, they don't understand park boundaries. Natural systems don't understand park boundaries. And it's impossible. The cities that surround our parks have such outsized impacts on the ecological health of the parks that we all steward. We need to focus much more on a different kind of social control, on building knowledge and awareness in the communities that surround our parks so that they both understand the ecosystems that we're maintaining, but also shape their behavior. This is an example of one that I'm particularly proud of because it's something that we did in our park. We have a lake in our park that abuts a neighborhood, and it was dying. And when we went to the community to try to figure out what was going on, what we learned is that all of the children in the community felt that it was natural, it was ecological to drop all their unwanted pets in our lake, to sort of liberate them in our lake. But those unwanted pets were actually destroying the ecosystem. And so we worked with the community to build a whole awareness campaign and also to build a pet amnesty box where kids could drop their pets and we'd find good homes for them. And it eliminated all of that. But had we not taken the effort or made the effort to actually help the community understand the negative impact they were having on the ecosystem, this practice would have continued and continued, and our lake would have continued to be destroyed. So I think thinking creatively about how to shape the behavior of the community that surrounds our parks so that both they don't have an impact on the park, but also so the way they manage their yards and their gardens can have beneficial impacts on the parks that are adjacent to them. I think we need to look very... Wow, it's incredible this morning. Oh, well, I'll keep going. We need to think very expansively about how we reimagine the cities that surround our parks and how we can take these unutilized landscapes that our cities are full of. I told Carl this morning at breakfast that the United States has 61,000 square miles of pavement. 61,000 square miles. The U.S. has 130,000 square miles of national park. So we have as much, almost half as much pavement in the whole country as we do national park space, which is staggering to me. But think about how we can utilize all of this incredible amount of pavement in cities to actually create landscapes that support the ecological value of our parks. It's not park per se, but it's expanding those landscapes that support parks out into the landscape of the cities more expansively, and that we really need to think of ourselves not as park makers, but really as city shapers. I think that, again, one of the things that was interesting to me about Olmsted and the picturesque park is people focus their attention within park boundaries. And I think it's critical that we think of ourselves as city shapers and have a bigger impact in the surrounding urban fabric. So, of course, the other thing I mentioned when I began is the incredible impact of population growth on parks. And we know that not only will there be more people on the planet eating more food, which will contribute to habitat destruction, but that a greater percentage of them will be living in cities. And so the pressure on our parks will grow acutely. So it's important that we make the best possible use of our parks. And I think it's interesting that when you really look at the landscape of many of our parks, even within our parks, there is so much underutilized space, so much wasted space. I love playgrounds because they're a simple example, but so much land that looks like this, that really could look like this. That could be engines that support intense activities, intensely engaging activities that allow kids to connect to nature, that allow people to connect to the outdoors. There, again, so much pavement in our communities that we can transform our neighborhoods into linear parks, even taking one lane out of our traffic, making our roads all one way. Or we can cap freeways. This is a project we just finished in the Presidio tunnel tops. Find new land over the tops of freeways and over the tops of buildings to expand the footprint of park, but also to build parks in the middle of dense cities, because one of the challenges we have in terms of creating equitable access is putting parks in heavily settled parts of our planet. And those parts, those areas, particularly in the United States, are often full of freeway. So freeway is an outstanding way, capping freeway is an outstanding way to address the inequitable distribution of parks and create more park space in heavily settled cities. The last thing I want to talk a little bit about is how we need to share power. We need to shift out of an expert mindset as park leaders and shift into a collective mindset, into a place where we're no longer the authorities, but actually the public are the authorities, and where we understand how to work in collaboration and in conversation with the public. I think it's safe to say that in the future, parks are going to have less money and fewer resources, and so we need to think more expansively about how we engage commercial interests. Olmsted thought that large urban parks were the antidote to the evils of commercial activity in cities. But the fact is that more and more and more we need to engage with the commercial activity of cities to build durable revenue streams that we can use to support our parks, and even consider things that would have been anathema to Olmsted, like having people living in parks and working in parks, so that the revenue from those folks can support our parks. That we need to think about solving problems through new collaborative kinds of efforts, like One Town, which brings together park land management organizations at all levels of government to restore the health of the Mount Tamalpais watershed in the Bay Area. That we need to think about models of co-management so that we can work in a more equitable and harmonious relationship with the traditional owners of land. And lastly, we need to address the barriers to equity. Now, in our own park, okay. All right. In our own park, in the Presidio, when we went to the community, we heard many things about the reasons that we didn't see everyone in our community coming to our park. And the answers were quite interesting. The first thing we heard was that our entrances to our park looked like a country club because it's a former Army base, and that it was off-putting. And that people remembered when it was an Army base, and I remember it as well. When you were young, you'd come to the Army base and you would be greeted by soldiers with guns and asked what your business was. And if you didn't look like they wanted you in the post, they would turn you around. We heard about the wall of wealth, that so many of our large urban parks are surrounded by these wealthy communities, and that those become a barrier for people to feel welcome and feel as though parks belong to them. That many historic large urban parks are incredibly unwelcoming. We heard from the community, for example, that the Presidio's severe, kind of stern military landscape was unbelievably unwelcoming to people and inhospitable. And then we have history. Many of our large urban parks have histories of displacement, they have histories of exclusion, or in the case of our park, they have histories of violent aggression against many of the communities that we're actually trying to serve and welcome to create equitable access to parks. So I believe in the future that we all need to listen much more deeply, and that we need to go out into the community rather than expecting people to come to us, and that we need to engage primarily with the people who aren't coming to our parks rather than the people who are, and understand their aspirations for the place. That we need to actually empower community to co-create the parks and to co-manage the parks with us in new and different ways. That we need to really step back and design parks for people. We need to ask ourselves, what are the kinds of things that we can do to take these often historic landscapes and make them more welcoming and engaging and fun? That we need to embrace the new. So much of what we talk about in park management are the conflicts between the new things that people want to do and our attitudes about park stewardship and park management. That we need to work with community to co-create the public realm. That we need to stop being the people that know how to do this better than anyone else. I remember when I started working for the Park Service, we were the best interpreters on earth. But in fact, the community, they're better at telling their own stories than we are. And so we need to shift our perspective and allow the community and work with the community to co-create the public realm. And we need to actively address these past harms that many of our parks were built on or were founded on in a very overt way and in collaboration with the communities that were impacted by these past harms. And lastly, we need to focus aggressively on building future stewards. We need to build generations of young people in our parks who will protect, instead of being focused on the next app that's coming out on their phones, is using those apps to help us restore the health of the ecosystems of our parks, and who appreciate and love nature as much as all of us, many of whom grew up in the environment. They love it as much as we do and are willing to protect it at all costs. Okay, technology's failed me. Well, okay. There's one more slide that says thank you, so thank you. I don't know. It's a cuter slide in any case. Okay. Thank you. All right. Anyway, I'm grateful for your time. I'm grateful you all are here. And it's like the first session after the beer party last night. I'm so impressed. So, we have 1 minute. Anyone have a quick question or a thought? Carl.
Yeah, great presentation, Michael. So, historically, when we're trying to make changes in public parks, the public or the political sphere, to a certain extent, is sort of years behind the park sector in terms of acceptance of this sort of thing. Or do you feel positive about the fact that environmental awareness is so high right now that this sort of transition can take place much faster than previous changes?
I do, actually, but I think the essential ingredient is building new coalitions with communities that historically have not felt welcome at the table, so that those folks show up, right? I mean, in our own park, we have a very conservative community. We're surrounded by the wealthiest people in the United States, and they don't want anything to change. And so what we've done is we've leapt over those neighborhoods, and we work very closely both on programming and on management, but also on understanding the needs of the lower-income communities beyond those. And they show up because historically they haven't been welcome at the table. And that has been an incredibly powerful force for us in terms of implementing these kinds of changes and overcoming the objections of the political elite, which, you're right, tend to be incredibly conservative. So, all right. Well, I think our time is up. I'm happy to stick around if anyone wants to chat more. And I thank you all, and I hope you have a great last day at the conference. Ciao.